Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became, and the more hungry he became, the more he ate, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of a house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs, and ate the most enormous breakfast. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 dish. Marmalade, 1 pot. When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile, and thought. "That was a delicious breakfast," he thought to himself. "Now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch." He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked. Then he discovered a cave. "That's funny," he thought. "I don't remember seeing that there before." Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to explore. He entered the dark cave. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was without doubt the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fellow, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house, and the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. Mr. Greedy sniffed again, and then decided that he must get up onto that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult, and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table, and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. Over on the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate, and on the plate huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages the size of pillows, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes the size of beach balls, and huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate and, being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. Suddenly a shadow fell across the plate, and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real, live giant. "And who," thundered the giant, "are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. "Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed a laugh as loud as thunder. "Ho, ho, 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 ho! Greedy by name, and greedy by nature," he bellowed. "Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson." And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. When he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh, yes," moaned Mr. Greedy. "I promise." "Very well," said the giant. "Then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door feeling very fat and extremely miserable. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? So if you know anybody who's as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell them, don't you? Beware of giants. The end. Mr. Busy by Roger Hargreaves. Read by Old Uncle Paul. There has never been anybody quite like Mr. Busy. He could do things 10 times as fast as ever you or I could. For instance, if he was reading this book, he'd have finished it by now. He lived in a very busy-looking house which he'd built himself. As you can see, it had lots of doors and windows, and do you know what it was called? Weekend Cottage. Do you know why? Because that's how long it took him to build it. One fine summer morning, Mr. Busy was up and about bright and early at 6 o'clock. He jumped out of bed and had a bath and cleaned his teeth and cooked his breakfast and ate his breakfast and read the paper and washed up and made his bed and cleaned the house from top to bottom, by which time it was 7 o'clock. Busy Mr. Busy. Now, next door to Mr. Busy lived somebody who wasn't quite such a busy person. In fact, he was a very unbusy person, Mr. Slow. If he was reading this book, he'd read it like this. He'd still be on the first page. And that same fine summer morning at 7:05, when Mr. Busy knocked at his door, Mr. Slow was fast asleep in bed. He'd gone to bed for an afternoon nap the day before and somehow hadn't woken up until he heard Mr. Busy knocking at his door. "Who's that knocking at my door?" he called downstairs. "Good morning!" cried Mr. Busy. "Can I come in?" And without waiting for an answer, he went inside. "Where are you?" he called. "Upstairs," came the slow reply. So Mr. Busy went upstairs 2 at a time. "Good heavens!" he said. "You're still in bed!" And he made Mr. Slow get up. And he made his bed for him and cooked his breakfast for him and cleaned his house for him. Poor Mr. Slow. He hated to be rushed and fussed. "Right," said Mr. Busy briskly. "It's a fine day. Let's go for a picnic." Mr. Slow pulled a face. "I don't like picnics," he complained. "Nonsense," replied Mr. Busy, and busied himself around Mr. Slow's kitchen making up a picnic for the two of them. It took him a minute and a half. "Right," he cried when he'd finished. "Off we go." And he bustled Mr. Slow out of his front door, and off they set. As you can imagine, Mr. Busy walks extremely quickly, and, as you can imagine, Mr. Slow doesn't. So by the time Mr. Busy had walked a mile, do you know how far Mr. Slow had walked? To his own garden gate. Mr. Busy hurried back. "Come on!" he cried impatiently. "Hurry up!" "Hurry up?" replied Mr. Slow. "Impossible." "All right," said Mr. Busy. "We'll have a picnic in your garden." "Wait a minute, though," he added. "The grass needs cutting." And he rushed back to Weekend Cottage and rushed back again with his lawnmower and rushed up and down cutting Mr. Slow's lawn. It took him 2.5 minutes. It would have taken him 2 minutes, but he had to mow around Mr. Slow, who couldn't get out of the way in time. "Right," said Mr. Busy. "Picnic time!" And together on that fine summer day they had a fine picnic. Well, actually, Mr. Busy had a finer picnic than Mr. Slow because he ate more quickly and had most of the food. Mr. Busy stretched out on the grass. "That was fun," he said. "I like picnics." "You do? I don't," said Mr. Slow. "Tell you what," went on Mr. Busy, ignoring him. "Tomorrow we'll go on a proper picnic out in the country." Mr. Slow pulled a face. "And," went on Mr. Busy, "in order to do that and get you out of the country, I'll have to call for you earlier than I did this morning." Mr. Slow pulled another face. "See you tomorrow, then," said Mr. Busy, and went home and cleaned his house from bottom to top. The following morning, Mr. Busy jumped out of bed at 5 o'clock, and had a bath and cleaned his teeth and cooked his breakfast and ate his breakfast and read the paper and washed up and made his bed and cleaned the house from top to bottom, by which time it was 6 o'clock. he went and knocked on Mr. Slow's front door. "Come on," he cried. "Time to be up and about, picnic day!" No reply. "Come on!" cried Mr. Busy again. No reply. Mr. Busy went inside, and went upstairs 3 at a time, and into Mr. Slow's bedroom, expecting to find him in bed. But he wasn't. And he wasn't anywhere upstairs, and he wasn't anywhere downstairs. "Bother!" said Mr. Busy. "I wonder where he's got to!" Where Mr. Slow had got to was under his bed, hiding. He didn't want to go on any picnic, not he. "Bother!" said Mr. Busy again. "That means I'll have to go on a picnic on my own!" Under his bed, Mr. Slow smiled a slow smile. "What a good idea," he said, and went to sleep, snoring very slowly. The end.